So let me now introduce our panel. I think we're very lucky to have such an interesting panel for this discussion. It'll be very hard to get together this group in London because such busy people. But first of all, Deyan Sudjic on my right here. Deyan is the director of the Design Museum in London. Before that, he was a journalist and a writer, well, still is a writer, producing many books, but he was design and architecture critic for the Observer newspaper. He was also Dean of the Faculty of Art and Design at Kingston University, and he's chaired the Urban Age Advisory Board. He's also known as one of the co-founders of Blueprint magazine in 1983, which is this year celebrating its 30th anniversary. So on my left, Abraham Thomas is the curator of the V&A's Design Drawings collection, which is an amazing collection ranging from work from the 15th century up to the present day. And part of Abraham's role is to consider what should go into the collection from work being produced in the here and now, which is a huge responsibility, I think. Abraham was also curator of Thomas Heatherwick's recent exhibition, which was a huge success at the V&A, and he also curated a show called One-to-One, Architects Build Small Spaces. He's currently working on a book about the V&A's collection of fashion drawings and photography, which is coming out next year. Vikas Satwalekar is a graphic designer and runs a studio with his wife here in Bombay called the Satwalekar Design Studio. And interestingly, we were talking about the way he works. It's a small studio, but he brings in people to work on particular projects, and a lot of that work is actually happening in Ahmedabad, where you studied at the NID. And you have an incredibly interesting range of projects working with the public sector and the private sector. So since 2004, working for the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, creating branded spaces for Tata, and as well as work with the national identities for the National Payments Corporation of India. So a very diverse portfolio. We're going to begin with a few comments from each of our speakers, just to kick us off and to put some ideas out there. We'll then have a bit of discussion, and then I'm very keen that we should open up to the floor, because I found all your comments very interesting yesterday, and then we can respond and have some discussion.
If one was starting a museum of design 50 years ago, you could have filled it with chairs and told the story of modern Western industrial design in a suitably appropriate, carefully chosen selection of chairs. If you did that now, you would be in a mausoleum more than a museum, because design has this extraordinary ability to keep on changing its shape. We're now in a period in which the digital revolution has triggered what one might call the age of mass extinctions of the analog era. If we think about all those things from cameras to music systems to books that have all disappeared and turned up in your smartphone, which will last maybe a year. That relationship we used to have with our objects has now completely been transformed, and it's the role of the museum not just to keep things from the past, but to go on looking at how things might develop. This image behind me is the current Design Museum in London. It was started 30 years ago, just about, by Sir Terence Conran, a man who made quite a lot of money out of design in the UK, retail and domestic design, and he felt that the time was right to put something back to society, and he began the Design Museum as a project inside the Victoria and Albert Museum, the world's first design museum, which has perhaps become a museum of decorative arts, an exquisite one. And the Design Museum began as a guerrilla project in the basement of Victoria and Albert, known as the Boiler House, and it spent 3 very successful years until it was time to start a new building, which is this. Once a banana ripening warehouse built in the 1950s, when London still had docks right in the city centre. The whole area became derelict, and this was taken over and transformed into this baby version of the Bauhaus, and opened by Mrs. Thatcher. Sir Terence Conran did want the Prince of Wales to open it, but he made the mistake of showing him a model of the building, and the Prince was rather surprised it had a flat roof and declined the invitation. So we had Mrs. Thatcher, who obviously approached this from the, shall we say, the commercial view of design rather than the cultural one, that design in that sense was something which was an outboard motor for British industry. We run it now, we have a collection, but it's actually mostly in storage, and we operate as a kind of multiplex cinema in which you can have 3 different exhibitions at the same time. We do 7 a year, and they range from graphics to architecture, this is John Pawson, constructing a full-size space within our museum. Trying to make architecture come alive in a gallery is always an interesting thing, but we try and do it with materiality, with large-scale images, and a sense of what it is that the architect's thinking of in creating that space. This is a show that we actually did about Sir Terence Conran. The cabinet of tools at the end is a remarkably touching image of design. He was given it as a gift by the craftsman in his furniture factory. Each piece is chosen to be the best tool of its kind, and a reflection in Terence's mind that you should never design something that you don't know how to make. This is a show we did with a fashion photographer, Timothy Walker. This is a show we did with Swarovski. We do every year an exhibition which is called Designs of the Year. We bring together 100 new designs from around the world as a chance to really see where the mood of design is moving. This is a show we did last year during the Olympics where we look at how design impacts on sport, everything from Formula One cars to performance-enhancing drugs, which could be seen in another kind of design. This is a show that we did last year with Christian Louboutin. This is, I would say, at the blockbuster end of our repertoire. It's important that we actually have shows which communicate with a wide audience and help support the others. We have many audiences. We have the general public, we have designers, but we also have young people. And for us, design is a fascinating way to open minds, even of those people, of children who are not necessarily themselves going to become designers, but it is a way, I think, to reach children who might not be academic, but are fascinated by shape, touch, feel, and meaning. And we are to live up to my words about design never standing still. We are now in the midst of moving to a new home. This is the former Commonwealth Institute, built in 1962. At the time, it was the most modern building in London. After wartime deprivation, modernity suddenly arrived. And this is actually a very resonant building. It replaced something known as the Imperial Institute, which in decolonialization seemed to be just the wrong word to have. The Commonwealth Institute was a showcase for the 54 members of the Commonwealth, each of which had a permanent exhibit inside it. A utopian dream which ran on hard times. The Commonwealth moved out 10 years ago. The building's been derelict. And 1962 was not a particularly good year for longevity of architecture in Britain, so the building leaks like anything, but it is an extraordinary space which we are in the midst of turning into our new museum, which will be 3 times the size of what we have, and we're now in the midst not just of creating the building, but understanding what a design museum for the 21st century might be. Thank you.
So I think it's just something to think about, that the world's first design museum and one of the world's first art and design schools, which evolved from that, were all based on lessons learnt from objects displayed by the India stand at the Great Exhibition. The second point was really a kind of more of a personal observation of the passion that I have within the collection that I work on in the museum, and that's this idea of process. I work on the design drawings collection, and I feel that often what you see in a design museum is not in fact design. It doesn't really represent designing. I mean, this was a concept that came up in the panel yesterday that Deyan was on. For me, the magic of design is really the nuts and bolts of how an object is created. It's the questions surrounding how an object is commissioned, who the client is, who the engineers are, how these objects are fabricated, the alternative designs that don't see the light of day, how these objects and products are consumed by a general public. And so, for me, a future design museum really must tackle that notion of process, representing the workshop, for example, and all the various people and craftsmen that are involved in creating an object. The final point I wanted to make is really related to where we are now in terms of design. And of course, we now live in a world where objects are created through digital processes. And so my sort of question and my sort of proposition today would be, if there was a new design museum created in this country, why not start by thinking, is there a need for physical artifacts at all? Because we live in a world where many objects are created as born digital artifacts, CAD drawings, they're simply files. And many museums are struggling with this idea of how we collect digital design material. I believe in the future we'll move to a model of sort of cloud-based collaborative collecting between institutions where we share digital design drawings through network systems of collecting it. And it won't be so much about drawings and boxes, which of course I love, and many of you here love the idea of looking at a drawing, that's very valuable. But I wonder whether in the future, if we're really going to meet that challenge of capturing a digital design process, it's not about the physical artifact, and that might be something to think about maybe in the discussion.
I have spent almost 4 decades touting my spiel on the relevance of design in India's socio-economic development. Hence, can say with a great deal of conviction that perhaps the most significant role a design museum in India should play is to make ordinary Indians aware of design and its potential to improve their lives. And to do that, the museum will have to go to the people, instead of expecting people to come to it. If interest is awakened, if people begin to realize that good design affects the quality of their lives over a period of time, design museums will probably mushroom instead of being a single edifice in a single location. But more importantly, there will be an increased demand for design. So how does a design museum go to the people? The Boston Museum's an interesting concept to re-engineer somewhat to our purpose. The one thing we have in India is that even towns of a certain size have a government-run museum, a science center, and certainly the 4 metros have at least one such venue. They are almost always used in tourist routes, so people do visit it. An audience exists, a museum network perhaps a little lethargic, but that also exists. So why not tap this audience and the locations to start with carefully curated exhibition modules on easily associated subjects which are understood by the people. For example, why not have an exhibit on the design for public transport at the CST? Another kind of exhibit which could draw people's interest would be textiles. All of this will need research and documentation, particularly at the design, as the design community in India is notoriously deficient in documenting design process, methodologies, and challenges. But I believe the resource that is collected in the process of creating target-specific exhibit modules, both physical and virtual, will eventually lead to be housed in permanent locations. What it would have achieved along with the resource gathering is the generation of public interest, perhaps created a wider audience than the traditional publicity and marketing route. A challenge whose time has come, irrespective of whether a design museum comes or not, is the creation of a cadre of trained curators for design. It is inevitable that the process must be expedited while discussions on the museum remain warm on the national agenda. Seize the opportunities, as it were. Lastly, I would urge that the term design be as inclusive as possible. Expand the content net beyond the comparatively narrow confines of archetypal design disciplines and definitions. An inclusive sectorial perspective could well include grassroots innovations that have impacted life in any significant manner, recognizing that India's need for design innovation is not necessarily limited to trained designers or imports. Thank you.
How does one decide what should go into a museum? Because one of the things that I've heard a few times over the last couple of days is the idea that design is everywhere. In fact, Draw said it this morning in his presentation. He said design is everywhere you look. And indeed, Vikas, you've just talked about the need to expand the concept of design. And in the UK, there's been a big discussion about whether sound should be treated as a design discipline, or service design as a fairly established now new area. And I think this does raise the question of, as curators and as designers and directors of museums, how do you decide what goes in and what doesn't? Because this is not just on an individual basis, but what sort of type of thing should go in. And Abraham, if I can start with you. You talked about process being really important.
First of all, I should start by saying that I think we should be as flexible as possible. I think we've all kind of hinted at the idea that design should be as all-inclusive as possible. And I think process is a big part of that, because design is a messy, uncomfortable business often. It's not always an easy process, and so to record those moments of failure and alternatives and the kind of nitty-gritty of design is really important. So I think design drawings and archival collections are really important.
But is that something the public's interested in? I mean, that process to me sounds like the sort of thing that designers would be interested in. But
I think it's important, though, to understand that design is not a work of art, and that is why process is so important. Yesterday I was talking about how art is allowed to speak for itself in the gallery context, and design needs to tell a story. If you show art, it's interesting to know that Jeff Koons' puppy is fabricated in a factory in former East Germany, but it's like the conjurer's magic is revealed if you actually say that or show that. Whereas design does need to know why. You need to know why something happened, how it was made, and what its significance was, maybe how long it was used for, what it cost. All these things are actually part of that story. But the wider point, though, is that I think there's a difference between a museum collection, which is something that is about conserving something for the future, providing resources and reference material, which is by and large not the public face of the museum. The other thing that a museum does, which is our model at the Design Museum, is that sense of a rotating exhibition program. And with that, you actually have the ability to touch on many subjects, which go from fashion to product design, and these are different stories, but beneath that, there needs to be a method, and I think one of the methods actually is process, that you actually use the focus of design through process to tell a story which reveals something about the things that we use in everyday life.
Because I think that's a great way of uniting disciplines as well, because if you're going to explain to a public audience why design is important, and because we use the phrase design is everywhere, and we kind of use it very easily within this audience, in this context, but to really explain to a public why design is important, it's by talking about process and explaining that these things all have a way of coming to being, but they also have a purpose, and they were commissioned by a city council, or they were commissioned by a private benefactor. There were sort of reasons why these things came into being as well, and that can only be explained by not just showing the object, but showing the kind of systems around it.
A point which I wanted to talk about, that cut short, but is really in textiles, for example. Textiles has a history. And I think over centuries, it has adapted itself to environmental changes to still maintain certain standards. So I think when you talk of design in a museum or something, unless that particular concept is explained, how do you really understand that particular piece of textile? Yeah. And it just becomes a pretty object. And it's not just pretty object or a decoration. It's well beyond that.
Yes, I mean, design, unlike art, always exists in relation to society and technology, manufacturing, and so on. But I mean, I think, Deyan, I think you'd accept that the Design Museum doesn't show the relationship between, say, vernacular or craft technique in the UK. I mean, within our context, it sort of starts pretty much with the modern movement, doesn't it?
Yes, it is rooted in the idea that design is about mass production, which is a history which starts somewhere around 1780. We don't go back that far either. But it is, for me, design begins with that moment at which the connection between the maker and the user was broken by machinery, and the profession of design, as we understand it now, appeared for the first time, this intermediary. But of course, as I was saying, design doesn't stand still, and I think we're now at a point when traditional industrial manufacturing techniques are also about to become obsolete, which is going to make the practice of design a very different one as well. And I think it's vitally important to go on being relevant, to go on looking forward. For me, a museum should be about activism, about trying to make things happen, about identifying the direction that the world is taking, rather than preserving things. I mean, is it not the case that the V&A actually has some display cabinets which are themselves part of the collection now?
Because a lot of them have been sold off to high-end fashion boutiques, but we have kept a couple as important artifacts of the 19th century system of display.
One of the things I'm curious to know, as a sort of outsider to museums, is the process that goes on internally when you have to decide whether something's worth collecting, assuming that you have a collection, or whether it's something that society's going to forget. That I'm interested to know.
Well, we're writing a policy, and I think our view is that we don't have one collection. We have a series of collections. We collect in a way that we don't try and compete with the Victorian Albert Museum. How could we? 4 million objects. But we've identified a number of areas which we think are interesting. So we want to look at design as first works. We want to look at design around particular moments of technical change. So the digital explosion, I think, is a very interesting one, looking, for example, at what cameras were like when they were still analog, just before the digital revolution and just afterwards, and repeating that with many different types, because you actually, when the shape of an artifact is in flux like that, really interesting things start to happen. We want to collect things which can show the process that you describe. So there are multiple collections, and they have different criteria, and one needs to be quite careful about you can acquire things, but they don't become part of the museum's collection. So it might be useful to reflect for a while on whether they actually do become that quasi-sacred religious object, which once you're actually part of the collection of a national museum, the original designer can't touch it anymore. You have to wear gloves before you're doing it. You need safety assessments before you move anything. Is there asbestos inside this radio? It becomes this kind of extraordinary paraphernalia which does transform a mundane object into something little short of sacred.
I mean, Abraham, you raised the question of digital archives. I mean, surely, given the amount of material that you can store on a memory stick, I mean, what's to stop a museum acquiring a lot more digital material and leave it for future generations to decide what's important? I mean, why do we don't even need curators anymore?
Well, I think there still is a role for a curator to be an editor, because with the digital revolution, the amount of material created has been sort of, a sort of factor of 1,000 in terms of the amount of material created. So I think there's still a role in terms of choosing those sort of snapshots of that sort of more fluid design process to explain the key points of progression and evolution of a project. So I think that's very important. But you're right in the sense that that sort of sense of connoisseurship of a drawing or an object is no longer the same. And it's, but I think another crucial point about the digital world that we live in now is that I think we will start working more collaboratively with other institutions, where you have architects working in a global context, and a British architect working in Italy might have their archive with an Italian institution, and the UK institution might acquire the British projects, and because we're all sharing it in a networked kind of format, it doesn't matter where you are physically to access that material, because it should always be about the researcher and how they access that material, and that's, yeah.
How important is the real object
Oh, it's still very important. I mean, I wasn't trying to say that the digital material should make us forget because the physical drawing, because a lot of practices still draw. I mean, many people still use that as an important sort of haptic process of exploring an idea. People still design around a table with a client or within an internal design team. So they're very important. It's just that there are huge amounts that we're not capturing. It's now that we need to act. I mean, the last 20 years, there's huge amounts of design material, those key moments that we're just not capturing because all we have are the sort of nice client presentation drawings or the initial back of the envelope sketch, and everything in between, all that important, ugly, messy stuff is not being preserved.
Vikas, as a practicing designer, how important is it for you to look at the archives and the work of previous generations or contemporaries?
Extremely important. And I think, you see, I'd like to draw a line in terms of what I said and what I do, because I think somebody's going to kill me for that. But the fact of the matter is that being a designer, I get carried away with that. So every time I go out, yes, I make a pilgrimage to the Design Museum, to the Victoria and Albert Museum. Yes, you do that. The fact is that if design is to widen its scope, it has to have many more inputs than just one monolith, which everyone would expect. And India is a collection of what? 200 Great Britons?
Yes.
So it will have to have many more museums.
Yeah.
So and it costs money. So that's why I suggested that while you're building collections, can the collections be built through exhibitions and simultaneously start writing curatorial notes? Because I think there is no evidence of the fact that how have designers worked. This is extremely important. India does not have it. I think, I talk for myself, I don't particularly write too well in terms of what I have done. Somebody has to do that.
But also, sorry, earlier on you were talking about the importance of designers not just talking to designers,
Yes,
but
that's
also
right.
having a forum for putting their work in front of the public. I mean, this increasingly is the emphasis of design museums, is to engage, is to have this conversation that you talked about, Deyan, yesterday. And I wondered, you know, in the Indian context, how that could best be done. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a key issue also here of whether a museum is for entertainment or improvement, as it was posed yesterday. And I must say, yesterday Deyan mentioned this, and I slightly balked at this because I thought, well, then what is it that separates a design museum from Legoland or...
Well, you're a bit of a Puritan, if I may say so.
Yes, true.
Why shouldn't it be an enjoyable experience? Why should you feel that good is being done to you when you enter the portals of this place? Yes, it might be being done to you. I hope it is. But I think that if you start off with that viewpoint, you're going to be rather ineffective in your role. It's not just sugaring the pill. It's an attitude of mind. Let's not forget that the National Gallery of Britain in London never had gaslight. Not because it was going to damage the artworks, but because the then trustees believed that if you actually had artificial lighting, it would mean that the working classes could come and see these artifacts after working hours. So it was deliberately kept as a preserve for an elite. And that sense of the museum being this daunting thing at the top of a flight of stairs with a colonnade is a very abiding image of museums which say keep out. It's the temple. And I think that a very different approach is now important to what makes museums work. It's not just the physical aspect of the museum. Also, I mean, we have at the moment almost 500,000 Twitter followers. Now, you might think that communicating the message of the museum through 140 characters at a time is not going to be particularly profound or meaningful, but it is the way that you can actually have a dialogue with the outside world, in which people who might never actually physically see the museum can get some sense of what it is. We've launched a free app about the museum's collection, which is being downloaded 250,000 times. There's so many ways to communicate which don't undermine the sense of the specialness of the architectural spaces and the physical presence of the object, but provide more levels of meaning to what you offer.
If I may, I'd like to pick up on that point of audiences because at the V&A we've kind of moved into this phase of engaging with popular culture more widely, and it's attracted huge amounts of controversy. We had an exhibition on Kylie a couple of years ago, which was really done as a strategic move to attract a brand new audience that might 10 years' time come back to the V&A as a design museum. But it also was rooted in the fact that we have a collection of theatre and performance. And so we had an exhibition on Grace Kelly, which was looking at, of course, the life of an actress, but looking at her role as a sort of fashion icon and how fashion was used as a way to subvert her image as an actress. I think it's next week, we have an exhibition on David Bowie that's opening, and that's very much about how an artist who's not just a musician, uses an image to say so much about performance, about design, about architecture, about urban space. And similarly, postmodernism was, took the museum in a whole new direction in terms of engaging with media such as music video, using film, things like Blade Runner as a way of talking about architecture and design. So I think there's something to be said for broadening that church and bringing in, new audiences, but also new ideas about what design is and what power it has.
I think it would be a good point to take the lights up and have the mics out and get some questions and points from the audience.
Why do we always feel the need to put the process or the product on a pedestal to have value?
Thank you.
How important is it for a museum to document mistakes or incomplete projects that might pave the way for the future?
Thank you. And one more.
What if objects don't really have that interesting story to tell about the process? And also, what if designers don't want you to see that process, or they don't want to show you the messy drawings? And what's the role of designers themselves with you wanting to collect their drawings? Do you work together with them? Do you collaborate with them? Because I don't hear you talking about the designers themselves in that respect.
Putting design on a pedestal, design mistakes, what if a designer doesn't want to reveal their process, which I think is quite a common thing I've come across as a journalist, certainly. And there were a couple of others as well you can probably remember. Deyan, do you want to kick off?
I think that mistakes are fascinating. Design, there's a myth about design, which is that it's the product of one person, usually a man, wearing a pink suit, whose biggest invention of themselves and an inability to stop talking. Design is actually a process usually of tinkering, that there are no eureka moments. Lots of people try to make something a little bit better. It's how the Industrial Revolution happened. It's how Steve Jobs stole the idea of the graphic user interface from Xerox's research park in California. And bit by bit, what began as a fantasy became a very usable idea. And of course, that's a process that's full of mistakes, and those are the things that you actually learn from as much as the successful things. Museum cafes, well, the Victorian Albert Museum got into an awful lot of trouble when it started advertising itself as being an ace cafe with quite a nice museum attached. But actually, the Victorian Albert Museum has transformed itself. It was a museum which, when the Boiler House project, the design museum was in it, had that attitude that actually it was a sacred temple in which the very idea that you might show a video work was impossible. And I think, and it has to be said, I would say this, that something of that period when the design museum was in there did transform the conversation at the V&A.
Perhaps I'll pick up the question about the acquisition process. It was kind of about how to work with designers. Of course, we work very closely with the designers when we acquire the materials. Sometimes it will be a purchase, sometimes it will be a gift. But in both cases, often it'll be preceded by a number of visits to the studio to understand how they work, to understand those key stages in the evolution of a project. And often there will be a material that they're uncomfortable about having in the museum, because of course we acquire things not to just lock them away. They're available through a study room, through public access. And but often it'll be a kind of healthy, tense discussion, because we'll often explain why it's valuable to show those mistakes that we heard about earlier on, those alternatives, because we take the long view. It's really about showing the sort of holistic view of a designer's career. And they may feel very sensitive about a project that was perhaps very recent, but we will always try and present the case for why it's important in a museum context to have that honest view, I think.
Actually, quite often the problem is to try to persuade them not to show everything.
Yeah, absolutely, that's true. That
Vikas,
often.
I just
can
want
I
to
ask
one
you
small
this question about process? I mean, you happy to reveal?
Processor, yes, I think that's fine. But I just want to add something that exhibits of why design did not work, I think are extremely important. And I think essentially because even on the part of the designer, they're important because design is a process. As a designer, you also have to decide when things don't work and when you go on to the next idea. And I think that to share is extremely important with everyone else.
Working out what it means to say that something works or doesn't work is also a very big question.
Absolutely.
I mean, do we mean something which sells well? Do we mean something which saves lives? Do we mean something which works in the fashion context? These are all very different definitions, I guess you could say, of function.
Okay, I found that a very interesting discussion. I'd really like to thank our panel. I mean, I'd just like to make a point, I suppose, which is a puritanical point, Deyan, you would say, but I think it's important to collect things that no one else thinks are important. I think that's one of the things that museums did in the 19th century and earlier, and possibly the guys that wouldn't put the lights on at the National Gallery, I think they had a point, which was that if you operate in a culture that doesn't appreciate something, but you feel passionately about it, and you stick to that. Perhaps, as many people have commented in India today, where you're fighting the corner for design really at a time when it should be taken more seriously by government and by business, then I think it's important to collect things, because then that allows future generations to understand where they come from, their history, and where they're going. And I think that museums, it's something we haven't really had time to talk about, but the role of museums in telling our story, I think is incredibly important. And it's the early adopters of museums that have allowed us to do that now. So
it's not at all puritanical. I'm with you on that one.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I really enjoyed that. Thank you.